Hello and welcome to this webinar. We're going to be exploring the topic of on-farm grain processing and exploring questions of whether value-added processing could be a good fit for you and your farm. By way of brief introduction, my name is Amy. I'm an organic farmer. Full disclosure, I grow hulless or naked oats on our small 240-acre organic farm here in the Interlake region of Manitoba. Yes, the fields are rocky and a lot of marsh, but also wonderful spots in between. Throughout the modules, there's going to be 3 different modules together in this webinar. I'm going to be drawing from my own experiences, as well as from what I've learned from others over the past 10 years of farming and grain milling. And hopefully this will allow you to avoid some of the mistakes that I've made along the way. As well, I hope that the topics that I'll be exploring will give you an opportunity to reflect and consider some of the aspects of food processing that you may not have fully considered yet, and will hopefully enable you to make the best decisions possible along your own farm journey. So nearly 12 years ago now, we decided to start an organic farm and a grain mill all tumbled together in one giant tangled mess. We were led by a strong desire to be part of a vibrant and diverse local food community in our home province of Manitoba. Driving to our home, we saw endless horizons of grain crops being grown, but I was stuck buying our grains from large brands from far away, and the two didn't seem to make sense. I wanted to be able to find grains that were grown and processed here as well. I wanted to bring food production closer to its source. So in the process of planning out our dream farm, we wrote up a business plan. That plan was wildly ambitious. We wanted to plant a crop of hulless oats, an ancient grain oat variety that we were in love with but had no experience growing. We wanted to build a new building, buy and set up equipment, get our product onto retail shelves, and have a financially successful business within 9 months. 2 years later, we were renovating a barn instead of building. Our fields had been too flooded to plant a crop on. 10 years further down the road, I would cautiously say that our farm and our mill are financially viable. But blind optimism isn't always a bad thing. Where would our society be without unattainable dreaming? But a little dose of realism and perhaps a better understanding of what we were getting into might have been a good idea. There are certainly aspects of running a farm and a mill together that are wonderfully synergistic, where one complements the other. But there are times as well when they both seem to be dragging us in opposite directions, making everything far more complicated than it needs to be. So, welcome here. Wherever this webinar finds you, I hope that it presents questions that will guide you as you work to build a farm and a grain processing enterprise that meets your goals for feeding the communities around you. Let's get started. So the first question that we're going to look at is simply, what is value-added processing? And so as a farmer, you know that you're constantly looking for different ways to add value to your own crop. And this can be things like the soil preparation that you do days, weeks, or years in advance of planting a crop in order to maximize your yields or your income. This can be the inputs that you add or that you don't add, the organic or regenerative methods that you're using to add value to your farm land or to the crop that will be harvested. This can be your seed selection and the varieties that you choose to plant. These are all different ways that as farmers we're continually looking to add value to our crops. But this module is going to be focusing specifically on the processing that would be done to a crop post-harvest. So looking at how to bring the harvested crop directly to the consumers who will be eating them. So I did a really quick research here and found out that approximately 45% of all calories consumed worldwide originate in grains. This might not be a really good idea. The Canada Food Guide suggests that only 25% of our calories should come from grains, but that's a question for someone else to be analyzing. What it tells me is that grain growing and grain processing is a really big category. Almost half of all of the grain, of all the food eaten around the world starts with a grain. Now, as a farmer, if you reach into the tank of your combine and you pull out a handful of the crop that you're growing, you know that this is something that could be eaten. You might want to pick out the grasshoppers and the chaff and the bits of straw and the occasional weed seed that comes along with that crop that you have harvested. um, but it certainly could be eaten and could sustain you. We also know that if you open up your pantry, for the majority of Canadians and North Americans, we don't have shelves that are lined with flax and lentils and oats and whole kernels of wheat. Most of the grains that we eat have been processed to bring them into a more convenient and easier to use form. And so each of these different levels of processing are different steps that you could undertake on your farm to add more value to your crop to retain a greater portion of the food dollars that consumers are spending. And so we'll take a look at some of those different steps that could be added. So the very first and most obvious step is to get rid of the grasshoppers. So just cleaning grains, the different processes and equipment that would be needed to sort out all the different extraneous material that people don't want to eat, so that you're left with a simple whole grain. This is the very first and most basic step of on-farm processing, and probably the most logical one to add. A lot of farmers have some of the equipment to do some of this processing, and it represents probably the most fundamental level of grain processing. Further to that, as a farmer, you can then choose to add one more step, which would be ingredient preparation. So taking the wheat that you've grown and milling it into flour, taking the oats that you've grown and pressing them into flakes, dehulling, splitting, pressing into oil, micronizing, roasting, steaming in order to stabilize a grain, mixing or blending several grains together, fractionizing a grain or a pulse to extract a certain nutritional element from it, or sprouting a grain so that it maximizes the nutrients from that grain. These are all different ways to make the grain product slightly more usable and more convenient for consumers. The next level as well would be to process into a ready-to-eat product. And when you get to that ready-to-eat category, there is certainly a whole nother level of intensity for the food safety requirements and the processing that's involved to get it there, but it is certainly what represents the most value to consumers, especially in our North American context. We value ready-to-eat products fairly significantly. We like things that are done for us and ready to consume. So taking the wheat that you've grown and turning that into a loaf of bread or a stack of cookies, taking oats and turning them into a plant-based milk, grains turned into cereal, or pasta. So this is another level of processing that you can add. Taking your barley, turning it into beer. All of these different levels are different options that are available to you as a farmer who's growing all of the different base ingredients that go into the products that fill our pantries. One more level, and I think it's one that's often overlooked, but probably shouldn't be. As a farmer, another option for value-added processing would be taking the grains that you've grown and combining several different types of grains together and formulating them as a livestock feed. So for a backyard hen mix, this might be taking oats or wheat together with peas and flax, doing the formulating and fractionizing that you need to, and then blending them together, perhaps pelletizing them, and packaging them up for animal consumption. So this isn't something that I'm going to focus on a huge amount, but it will come up a few times throughout the modules. And it's in a whole different level of grain processing, and one that's fairly attainable on the farm scale. It's targeting grains for animal consumption. So I just want to emphasize that there's not just one option of grain processing. Grain processing can mean several different layers, several different levels, and how many layers of processing to add is not a simple decision to make. It's one that should be calculated quite carefully, because it will change what that story of grain processing looks like for your own farm. So perhaps backing up just one small step from what value-added processing can look like is why we should be adding value to our crops. This isn't a given. The majority of farms and the majority of the most successful farms will certainly be focusing on one aspect of food production, which is growing and harvesting the crops and then selling that into the commodity market to be processed elsewhere. So why might you, as a farmer, want to add that level of processing to your own farm? Well, one reason is economic. Farmers take home a very small portion of the food dollars that are spent by consumers. In 2021, the most recent year that I was able to find data for, farm revenue, so the crops sold from a farm, accounted for $76.9 billion, including the exports. So this is all of the grain that's sold within and outside of Canada, grown by Canadian farmers, 76.9 billion. On the flip side, the food and beverage processing sales, and this is only the food and beverage that was sold within Canada, so excluding exports, accounted for 141.3 billion in revenue. So right around double the revenue from processing compared to the crop production. So logically, there's a large portion of the consumer's food dollars that can be gained by doing some of that value-added processing on your farm. As I talked about briefly as well, our economic system and even our culture doesn't really value or even know how to use the whole grains and ingredients as much as we know how to use and value the ready-to-eat products. So I was walking into a grocery store with my kids just a few months ago, and as we walked through those really big sliding doors to get into the grocery store, both sides, on the right and the left, and straight ahead of us and all around, gigantic big bags of salted buttered popcorn. There must have been some type of promotion because they were just everywhere. And of course, the kids decided they wanted popcorn for lunch and not the bagels and hummus that we had come in looking for. So we, pushed our way through these giant bags of popcorn. And as we made our way to the checkout at the end of our shopping trip, we were standing in line, and ironically, the person right behind us, kind of walked up behind us and asked the cashier, "Excuse me, I just need one more thing before I'm done shopping. I really want some popcorn." And so the cashier, gestured towards the front where there's these gigantic bags swallowing everyone up as they walked into the store. I said, "No, I want to make my own popcorn at home." And the cashier looked really puzzled. Like, popcorn kernels? You want to make your own popcorn? So she thought about it for a little while, and maybe aisle 6. I think somewhere on the bottom shelf, aisle 6, you might find some there. But it really was a puzzle. She didn't know where they were. She didn't really know if they even had any. As consumers, we like to eat the food that's ready, prepared for us, and we can consume on our drive, on our way home from work. So the easier something is to consume, the more likely we are to spend our hard-earned dollars on purchasing it. So as farmers, we can capitalize on that by adding value to our own crops. Another factor that might come into your own decision and might be one of the reasons why you're looking into value-added processing is, as farmers, we often started growing crops and growing food because of a passion for feeding people. It's a really, really magical feeling to sit on a combine and to pull food from the earth, and then be able to know that the work that we're doing is creating something that's going to feed people. But the farming system that surrounds us means that farmers are increasingly dependent on external markets, on financial factors like exchange rates, tariffs, transportation, logistics. All these external and economic factors can change what crops you can get value from. They change the viability of our farm, and the commodification of food, changing food from something that you look at it as a farm and you can eat this, into a commodity that has a certain value based on economic factors. It creates a huge disconnect in our society. Consumers don't understand or value what we eat, and the farmers who grow the crop never really get to see that full picture either. And so adding value and further processing to our grain crops is actually a way of creating direct and meaningful connections between our farms, between our land, and between the communities around us. And so this might be something fairly esoteric and and theoretical, but I think it's what drives a lot of us to add processing to our farm, because we want to be growing food. We don't want to be growing commodities, and watching the food that you've grown actually make it directly to consumers' homes is something that's it's a whole nother aspect of farming that we have lost in much of our culture. So kind of to summarize, on-farm processing can add value to our crops. It can increase your farm revenue and your stability, but we'll talk about that a bit more, and help agricultural producers take home a larger slice of the food dollars that consumers are spending. And it can create meaningful connections between our land and our communities. So I've been called an optimist before, perhaps an incurable optimist. And so we're going to start with looking at the positive side of on-farm grain processing. So we're going to look at some of the positive aspects that might influence your decision to add processing to your farm. And so the first, and I think this is really significant, is that in addition to capturing more of the food dollars from consumers, is you can maximize income from a limited number of acres. And so this might be particularly important to you if you're in organic production and transitioning non-organic or conventional land into a chemical-free farming might be just a long and tedious wait. And so that might be something that's impacting or restricting your ability to grow. It might simply be where you're located, either proximity to an urban center, other geographic features, or just the skyrocketing cost of farmland might make it really difficult to expand beyond where your farm currently is. And so if you're looking at trying to make your farm profitable, sometimes simply scaling up and adding more land isn't a possibility. And so if in that type of situation, maximizing the income that you get from a limited footprint can be really valuable. The flip side of that, however, is that if you were to start processing the grains from your own farm, to start with something like 10 or 20 acres might be even fairly ambitious to be able to process and to sell that much crop. So if you're looking at a small farm and looking at how you can double or triple the revenue that you make from those acres, that can be fantastic. But if you have a larger farm, if you're sitting on 3,000 or 5,000 acres, and you're going to triple your revenue from 20 acres, that's not going to have a real significant impact on the take home at the end of the day. And so considering and being realistic about how much you can actually process and sell is a significant part of the decision-making process, and that will come into play all the way through your processing journey. As we talked about on the previous slide, a lot of farmers have always been a little bit of cowboys. We like to do things on our own, and so working within a commodity system that adds external economic constraints onto our farming operations is not something that a lot of us like. And so being reliant on exchange rates and transportation logistics, if that's something that you want to be avoiding, if that's something that detracts from the value of your farm, then adding processing can really cut out a lot of those external factors. And so you can be more self-sufficient with your farm operations by taking some of those processing opportunities and doing that processing on your own farm. Hand in hand with that, with marketing grain crops, we know that it's really unreliable. There'll be peaks and valleys in the commodity pricing for our crops, sometimes really quickly and unpredictably. So the crop that we grow one spring might be a fraction of the market price that we were expecting to get for it. And this can be a really difficult factor to deal with. And yet, when we look at the grocery store pricing, we might see a steady creep in prices, but we almost never see huge peaks and valleys in the shelf price to consumers. And so a lot of those peaks and valleys in commodity pricing can be moderated out by doing some more of that processing. As someone who's selling directly to consumers, you can anticipate raising your prices by a small increment every few years, but you're not going to be doubling or halving the price that you're asking from consumers. And so it can really help to moderate what you're expecting to get from the crop that your land is growing. Similarly, when you're adding more processing, you're going to be limiting the transportation of your crop. So this might be significant if you're looking at reducing the carbon imprint of your farm, and it can be significant for just from, again, a bottom line and stability perspective, because the transportation costs can vary widely, and transportation sometimes isn't even available. It can be a really frustrating experience for farmers to have a brilliant crop that they've harvested and they have a market that's willing to pay for it, but transportation simply is not available. So again, on-farm processing can kind of cut out some of those external factors that are outside of the control of our farms. Another, maybe one of the more significant factors, I think, one of the great benefits of on-farm food processing is adding diversity to your work tasks. So as farmers, we spend a lot of time fixing equipment and sitting on the seat of a tractor. When you're adding processing, you're going to be adding huge doses of different types of tasks. So consumer relations, equipment and processing equipment design, product development, product testing, website interfaces, social media, graphic design, packaging, book work, and traceability. These all represent different tasks, and they may not be better tasks, but they do mean less time on the seat of a tractor and more time doing a huge number of different tasks. So if you're someone who finds that you're getting bored quite easily of one job and you like to gravitate to the new and exciting, then farm processing might be a good fit for you if you excel in doing a whole number of different tasks. And then finally, back to that topic of increasing community economic resilience. And so when we live in a society where consumers don't value and understand their food, by adding processing, you can create a real sense of cohesion in the community around you. People start to understand the food that's grown where they live. Economic and food security resilience can be another factor that might be something that's really important to you in your community. We look at how is it that how can we feed ourselves in some type of change that might impact our society. We saw this with supply chain disruptions, of course, with COVID, and around the world, we know that the more locally food is grown and processed, the more resilient we'll be against changes. So creating cohesion within society and resilience to resilience and food security can be another factor in why you might want to pursue farm processing. And my husband and I jumped from studying philosophy to farming, and so this isn't a factor that's going to impact the profit and loss or the balance sheet at the end of the year. But the reasons for diving into on-farm processing are not all economic. There are personal and relational and other factors that will drive you to do the things that you do. A recent survey, sorry, not recent at all, 8 years ago, a survey in 2015 asked, does your job make a meaningful contribution to the world? And this is a survey in the UK. 37% of survey respondents stated that their jobs did not make a meaningful contribution. And so we're looking at a society that's fairly disconnected from the tangible, from having real and significant value to people around you. As a farmer and as a food processor, it is undeniable that what you do makes a meaningful contribution to the world around you. And so then we're going to move on away from the good, and we're going to move on to the bad. So as much of an optimist as I am, even I have to admit there is a bad and a very, very ugly side of on-farm food processing, to balance off some of the positives. Similar to farming, as much as we like to focus on the really good harvests, filling our grain bins at the end of a good season, there are summers that are stopped short by infestations of grasshoppers or other factors that means that no matter what we do with our practices, our farming practices, our agronomy, that type of good harvest situation doesn't always happen. With processing, a lot of the negative gets stacked up very early on in the game. There are a lot of upfront costs with developing a food processing component to your farm. Facility construction, retrofits, processing equipment, all of these things need to take place before you have any chance of even bringing a product to market. So with my own experience, we experienced those upfront costs fairly dramatically as we started to farm and process all together. So we planted a crop of oats and we harvested them, and then we borrowed a little bit of processing equipment, just a seed cleaner, and cleaned our seed to be able to scale up to get enough seed to plant for the next year. So second year in, we harvested a second crop that looked even bigger and better than the first year, and we thought we were time to get started with processing. So we bought equipment to clean our oats, purchased milling equipment to clean out the chaff and the impurities from our oats. We purchased milling equipment to dehull our oats and roll them into flakes. We retrofitted a farm building, added new walls, painted, sealed the floors, added wall coping, shatterproof lights, had a few different health inspections, developed packaging, purchased UPC codes, conducted nutritional analysis, created nutrition facts tables for our products, printed 10,000 packages, which is our minimum print run, did 6 months of shelf life testing, and finally brought 6 packages of oats to our nearest retailer. So 12 pounds of oats. So I'm standing there in front of the counter of the shop owner, and I'm explaining to her this wonderful product that we have and why she should be selling our product on her shelves. Anna folded her arms and looked at me and said, I don't know, running a shop is pretty risky. If people don't buy this product, it's going to sit on my shelf and I'm going to be out $30. So she asked if I would sell my oats to her on consignment. As farmers, we're used to putting a lot in the ground every year, taking a lot of financial risks with the crop that we grow. And farm processing only makes that worse. It means that there are even more upfront costs that you need to be able to meet before you can bring your product to the market. Stats Canada indicates that a manufacturing industry has a 28% chance of surviving the first 10 years of business. Food processing would be somewhere in that category, and I would suggest the failure rate's probably even higher. So those are pretty dismal stats, particularly considering when you already have a farm operation that can be really difficult to pay the bills. So adding farm processing has the potential of increasing your revenue and also the potential of crashing down on you in a ball of flames. So another factor that you want to consider when we look at the price to consumers from a processed crop that's sitting on the store shelves, it can seem like a really easy way to just increase the value that you're getting from your crop. Rather than selling wheat at a few cents a pound, why not sell flour at a few dollars a pound? But the question that you need to be asking yourself is not, do I want to make more money from my crop? It's, do you want to have a second job? Do you want to do a whole nother business stacked on top of farming? Because food processing and farming are two distinct operations and probably operate better when somewhat detached from each other. It's not just waving a wand and making more money from the crop. It's stacking another industry on top of it. A significant portion of that industry is in food safety and regulatory, and so there is a lot of work involved with designing and implementing a food safety system that will meet the requirements for bringing your product directly to consumers. And so if you like doing a lot of paperwork, that might be a really fantastic one for you. But again, it's a whole nother industry to add on top. I've talked about this earlier as well. It would be very, very difficult to sell the same type of quantity and volume of crop that we as farmers are used to selling. A semi-load of processed products will probably take years and years before you're able to gain that type of volume of sales. And depending on your processing business, that might never be the goal. So you certainly have to look at selling your crop for a higher price, but likely much less of it. And finally, managing multiple interdependent businesses stacked and layered on top of each other. And so if you have a really fantastic year farming, this might be able to impact your processing. Sometimes it means that you might be able to offer a sale on your product or pursue new customers. And sometimes these stacked businesses will collide with each other unpredictably, and you have a bumper crop in the same year that you have decreased demand for your product, and looking at trying to spin off your excess production. And so there's a lot to juggle with anytime you have two different operations that are stacked together. And that is certainly the case with farming and food processing. So another way to add value to the crops that you grow on your farm is not just transforming that crop into a product that consumers might value more greatly, but also just moving that product and getting into the hands of the end consumer. So I'm going to explore that a little bit through what I'm calling the grain value chain. So I've got this value chain divided into a number of different categories, all the way from growing and harvesting crops here, all the way up to selling to the end consumer at the final end. And I have these broken down into some broad categories of approximately what value is represented through each category. You'll notice just really briefly that none of these categories have a huge portion of the profit. Unfortunately, there's not one magic step in here that's turning monster profits. There's an interesting book written by David Graeber, his book Bullshit Jobs, A Theory. And one of the basic premises of his book is that if a good or a service is a component of a basic human need, it's likely underpaid. Let that sink in for a moment. The best paid jobs are those that have been more recently added in our society. Jobs in finance, entertainment, banking, corporate law, public relation firms, real estate. The lowest paid jobs consistently are those jobs in home construction, renovation, manufacturing of goods, and food production. Following that same theory, milling flour will likely be less profitable than decorating wedding cakes because bread really is essential to life. But it's not all doom and gloom. The opportunity is analyzing where you yourself might have synergistic advantages based on your labor force, your personal abilities, the infrastructure on your farm, your proximity to different markets, and your farm's existing operations. You can add value by adding one or several links to this value chain to your farm operations. The further along the chain you go, your farm will retain a larger share of the profit. But the bad side, the further along the chain you go, you're going to add more complexity, and you're likely going to be restricted by geography and volume. Your market share will likely decrease the further along the chain you go. So if we start at this first number one here, growing and harvesting crops, and then you sell, the next step would often be to sell to transport and brokerage those crops, and then it would end up at a grain cleaning facility, and that grain cleaning facility represents another 10% of the value share for the crop. Here you can off-ramp. You can then clean that grain and then sell directly to another broker. And then you would be selling cleaned grain rather than bin run crop. Or you can keep going further down the value chain. You can skip out the transportation and brokerage, and you can start milling your own grains, creating a flour or a flake or an animal feed or pelletized or further milled product. Again, there's roughly another 20% of the value that can be retained here. Once again, you have the opportunity to off-ramp. You can then sell those milled products, by the pallet load or by the semi-load to the export market. However, if you go further down along the chain, you skip out the transportation and brokerage, and you decide to package and label and sell your products to retail or to food service, you have the opportunity to retain another approximately 15% of the value of your end crop, but you are more likely going to be restricted to the province where your product was grown for a number of different reasons. It's often provincially. If you go further and you sell, I guess at this level you could sell nationally. The same packaging would be applicable throughout the entire country, but that's going to be fairly difficult to gain those markets. If you sell directly to a retailer or to a restaurant, once again, you'll be restricted to the province that you're selling within. And again, if you're selling to the end consumer, you retain the entire value of the crop that you've grown. You're now retaining 100% rather than just 20% of the value over here, but you're restricted to those people that you can communicate with directly, the people who will come to you at the farmer's market or reach out to your farm store. So the further along the value chain you go, the more profit you retain, but the lower your volumes and the smaller your geographic reach. So these are some of the factors. Again, you can choose what your own farm processing might look like and off-ramp at any one of these different categories. Hello again, it looks like I'm back in the little bubble on the bottom of your screen. So now we get to the fun part, identifying your product. And this is likely what probably drew you to the slide. You probably already have this in mind. It's most likely that you know what crops grow particularly well and what you're passionate about, what you'd be really interested in bringing to market. And so this is something that often drives someone's decision to go into value-added processing. But I want to ask some questions that might help you to analyze whether that is actually a good fit for you or not. So some different products, again, can be whole grains and pulses, minimally processed grains like flours, flakes, oils, blends, animal feeds, can be sprouted, roasted, steamed, fractionized, or again, ready-to-eat products like the wedding cakes, of course, of the world. And so some of the questions that you might want to ask yourself then when you're considering which product makes the most sense to bring to grocery store shelves, is there a particular crop or a particular variety of that crop that's not available locally that grows particularly well? Of course, if it's not available locally, you need to ask yourself a few questions. Maybe it's simply something that consumers don't value in your community. It's possible that it's something that grows really well, but people haven't caught on to. So that might present some significant barriers then. Or it might be a real market opportunity where people would use a lot of that product if it was readily available. Again, if the product is available and it's common on the store shelves, but there's not a local version of that product that also represents a market share, there's certainly a number of consumers who will always be looking for a local version of a product. They want to be eating food from their communities, from their province, certainly from their country. And so if that doesn't already exist on the store shelves around you, then that is a good opportunity. Additionally, is there any type of feature of your farm that you would be able to communicate well to consumers that would be valued by consumers who would be buying the product, but that's undervalued in the commodity market? So an example of this in the current climate would be something like if your farm is regenerative, and that's not something that processors or brands are focusing on or communicating to customers, and they're not paying you additionally for that product, but you know that the community around you is looking for something that's more than organic or different than organic, then that might be another opportunity for you. Is there a particular crop that grows well on your farm, but that poses challenges in marketing? So those marketing challenges might be something like fluctuating demand, where it's really highly valued one month and then no one will buy it again the next month. Again, inconsistent commodity prices can make it really, really difficult to manage a farm. If the price plummets and then skyrockets, it's hard to know what kind of inputs you can afford to put into that farm, into that product, and difficult to manage the budget when the pricing changes. If you're doing your own processing, you're paying yourself for your product. So you might not be able to offer the highest price, but you can offer a consistent price. Another factor that might make it particularly a good fit for a good product is if the crop that you sell is processed a fairly long distance away from you. You can save the money in transporting that product and skipping out that portion of the transportation. So when you've kind of looked at some of those different challenges, then again, how many layers of processing do you want to be adding? Do you want to be, if you know what grows well, do you want to be cleaning or milling or adding further value to that? Again, recalling that you'll increase your profit share with each step, but also increasing your complexity, all of the barriers that will stop you from actually finishing the process, and you're going to be increasing your risk as you go. You also want to be asking about barriers to entry for processing. Things like dehulling, roasting, sprouting, fractionizing, blending. These are more and more difficult to do at the farm level, and so that does pose some barriers, but barriers are not always negative. You want to consider that, that if you can do a product very easily, your competition is likely not very far behind you. But if you can overcome one of the barriers that are present in processing, it might be that you have a market niche that no one else is able to capture. So these are some of the questions that I would suggest that you consider with your own product before jumping into it. Another factor that's fairly important as you're beginning to evaluate whether or not a jump into food processing is a good fit for your farm is what the infrastructure needs might be for your processing endeavor. We know that farming is not easy on your bank book. It requires significant access to capital and the land values are getting more and more unattainable all the time. And so you are likely already stretched financially in order to be able to purchase the land and the equipment that you need for farming. Now, there's two different ways that this can impact you. The investments that you've already made into farming may be helpful leverage in starting a processing business. It might be able to be a kind of collateral for further loans that you might make for purchasing additional equipment or building new buildings. Or it might simply be an impossible burden. It might be that you're already so far leveraged that it's impossible to add anything further. And it would be processing is something that will certainly require additional access to capital. And so that is definitely a consideration. But with the buildings, there can be some synergies that allow you to save some money. So analyzing whether or not there is existing space and infrastructure on your farm that could be repurposed or renovated to be used for processing facilities could potentially pose a significant advantage that you may have. When we started milling, we jumped into the process assuming that we would be building our own building. We applied for loans and we started to plan and to work on construction plans for building a new building. And fortunately, before we started, we called the provincial health inspectors and we asked them a few questions. And they offered to come down and tour our farm and see what kind of recommendations they could make. And the recommendations they made were that we should simply renovate one of the existing buildings, which is not what we were expecting. We were expecting the requirements for food processing to shy away from a barn, a building that was used as a barn, and that they would say there's no way that something that had horse manure on the floor could possibly be used for food processing, but that's not the case. They made some recommendations for how the space could be cleaned and renovated and repurposed to be used as a mill. And so that was a huge advantage that we came across, that we were able to do some fairly simple retrofits. And so if you're doing kind of the lowest risk processing, so dry milling and providing a product that would be processed further by the consumer or by another value-added processor, some of the basic requirements are really simple. Sealed door openings, washable walls and floors, so this can be simply concrete floors and painted walls, shatterproof lights, and again, sealed openings so that pests and rodents aren't able to get into the building. So this is a recommendation that I would most highly make before you jump into any type of processing, any type of renovations or building or purchasing any equipment. I would certainly reach out to your provincial health inspectors and ask if they're able to make site-specific recommendations for your own farm. As you jump further into the processing that you'll be doing, you might find that the equipment that is required for your value-added processing is less common than farm machinery, so a little bit more difficult to find. If they won't generally be available at farm auctions at your neighbors, and they'll be certainly harder to liquidate if it turns out that you need to be replacing or changing to different equipment. So you might be able to find some of the grain milling equipment from more locally, but some of the processing equipment may not be available. Just a few slides back, I alluded to the concept that your geographic reach and who you sell your product to might be impacted by the level of processing that you've chosen to undertake. And so I'm going to dive into that a little bit and look at some of the different regulations that might restrict your geographic reach. And so generally we would divide this into 3 different categories: direct to consumer, so those people that you can meet face to face, whether that's a neighbor coming to your farm or yourself taking your products to a farmer's market. If you're interacting directly to the consumer, that's the direct to consumer. Again, the next level would be selling within your province, selling to a retailer or to a restaurant, and then those customers sell it to the end consumer. And then the final category is selling outside of your province, so selling either to a direct to consumer or to a retailer, food service, or distributor that's outside of your home province. Now, unfortunately, in the grain world, there's really only 2 different categories. So once you have, you can take grain from your combine and you can sell it to whoever you want without any additional inspections. But as soon as you've milled or cleaned your grain, as soon as it's gone through any additional levels of processing, it's considered to be a processed product, and the provincial regulations and inspections apply, even if you're selling that to the neighbor next door to you. And so generally, we're going to be looking at meeting the provincial requirements for selling our grain products. So those provincial requirements are a little bit different with each with each province. And so you'll want to look into the provincial regulations either in the province that you're residing in. So in Manitoba, that would be Manitoba Agriculture, or in Saskatchewan, the Health Authority, the Alberta Health Services. So these are the different departments in each province that regulate and set the standards and criteria for what your food processing facility and processes need to look like. Now they are quite similar, one province to the other. There's not that many changes, but sometimes the details matter. So you should be certainly looking into what those requirements are for your specific province. But irregardless of where you are, you will generally get inspections regularly, and these may be announced or they might be someone just showing up for an inspection. But for low-risk processors, and that's considered grain milling, if the grain is going to be processed further or cooked by the end consumer, then it's considered a low risk. And so inspections are usually just once a year, and often they're scheduled in advance to make sure that you're home at the right time. And so you would be budgeting a couple hours for an inspection, and there's quite a few different categories that the inspectors will be taking a look at. They're going to be wanting to verify that you have good practices in place, that your cleaning is done frequently, well enough to keep the facility in good order, that you have good maintenance procedures to keep all of your equipment in good operating condition, that you have quality control in place to make sure that the product that you're developing is consistent and not going to be unsafe for people to eat, that you have some basic traceability in place so that you know which product is going where, and you have good personnel operations to make sure that the people who are interacting with your product are keeping everything safe and clean. For selling outside of the province, all of these things are required. You'll still get inspections from your province, but there will be an additional level of inspections that also take place. So again, if you're doing a grain product and you're in your province, but you've decided to sell to your neighboring province, you would then need to get the Safe Food for Canadians license. And so that would be enabling you to sell across the country. for the license, there is a small annual fee. I think it's maybe $200 or $300. It's not significant, but what is significant is the different criteria that the inspectors will use on the federal level for inspecting your facility. So again, for low risk products like milled grains, an inspection is going to be annual or sometimes even biannual, so every second year for low risk processors. But the inspection will be carried out by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And it would be an inspection that dives into a much greater detail than what would be expected on the provincial level. So you can be expecting several days for an inspection, and in that inspection, they'll usually just target a few different specific areas of your food processing. So when you compare, 2 or 3 hours to look at every single different component compared to several days for looking into just 2 or 3 different areas, yeah, you can appreciate that the level of detail that they're looking for is much greater. So on the Safe Food for Canadians level, with the audit, the inspectors will be looking to see that you have good practices in place, but they will also be verifying that you have a preventative control plan for each of these areas. So that preventative control plan is written procedures that explain and regulate your operations and documentation systems to verify that your procedures are followed. Now, I think I read kind of what that meant hundreds of times and never really fully appreciated it until I started to sell outside of the province, and we had our first inspection at the federal level. So to give just one example, at the provincial level, your inspectors are going to come to your facility and look at whether or not there's evidence of mice in your mill. So they're going to be looking in the corners with a flashlight and under your pallets, looking to see if there's evidence that there's any mice that have gotten into your building, whether there's corners that look like they would be an attractant for pests, and whether or not you have traps that are in good working order and that you're checking your traps regularly. When the federal inspectors come in and they take a look at your facility, they're going to be looking, again, to make sure that there's no evidence of pests, but they're also going to be analyzing your written pest control plan. So this would be a document that you've developed showing the possible risks, how these risks are moderated through the design considerations, how they're moderated through your cleaning procedures. It's going to explain and map what controls are in place. You're going to explain the frequency of your control measures and document and verify all actions taken. So at the provincial level, the inspectors are looking to see if there's pest traps and make sure there's no mice around. At the federal level, they want you to complete paperwork every time you check a mousetrap. And so that's kind of like a really basic explanation of kind of some of the differences. The differences is not in what the final result is. On both ends, you're seeing a safe and clean facility, but at the federal level, you're looking for proof that you have systems that will ensure that that facility will be safe and clean all the time. So that kind of gives just a really brief explanation of the differences between selling within and outside of your province. So once you've determined your geographic reach, the next thing you're going to look at is who you want to be selling to within that geographic area. So I've divided this into 4 fairly broad categories, although they don't really get divided up quite clearly, but I'll talk about them in a second. And so we're going to be looking at each of these, and then I'll break into a little bit of detail of some of the different considerations and the factors that might help you to decide which one would be a good fit for you to sell to, or several, or all. Personally, we started selling directly to retailers as our first step. Started to dabble in selling to restaurants and to some food services, a little bit of ingredient processing for larger buyers, and then we jumped to direct-to-consumer sales at the very end. So there's no right or wrong way of doing this. I think kind of classically, people would think of starting with direct-to-consumer sales, and I'm really happy that we actually started out selling to retailers before we started sitting at farmers markets. There are very different ways of interacting with your consumer. You have different customers to be keeping happy, and one is not always a good fit for each individual product. I have this in a pyramid here, but as maybe, because there's not really a better way, maybe there is. I couldn't think of a better way to break them up. Ingredient processing would fit into a lot of the other categories as well. A lot of times grains will be processed by someone else before it's sold in a retail store or it's used in a restaurant or before it gets to a consumer's home. And so ingredient processing, it doesn't really divide, food doesn't divide into ingredient processing or retail. It can often fit into both. And so I wanted to kind of quantify what each of these categories might look like, but ingredient processing it doesn't really fit into the same type of categories. But in a more general sense, when you look at where is the majority of food being sold, grocery retailers certainly take the lion's share of food that's being sold in Canada. StatsCan from 2019 tells us that the average expenditure per household in Canada was $7,536 in grocery stores annually. That same household would spend approximately $2,775 in restaurants. And although the final number relates only to farmers markets, I think it would probably be a significant portion of the direct-to-consumer sales. The average household in Canada spends approximately $98 in farmers markets. So just looking at some really basic numbers for market share, $7,000 per household spent in grocery retailers, almost $3,000 in restaurants, and about $100 at a farmer's market. But let's not conflate quantity with value, and let's dive into what each of these might look like for you as a farmer. So first, we're going to take a look at selling direct to consumer, the very tippy top of my pyramid, and the component that represents the teeniest, tiniest little morsel of consumer dollars. But despite being small, I think selling direct to consumer offers some really significant advantages that shouldn't be overlooked. So when we were looking earlier at the chain of processing value, when you're selling direct to consumer, you're able to capture the entire spectrum of value that a consumer is going to be paying for their food. There's no middlemen in between. There's no transportation or brokerage or distributors or retailers who are taking a portion of the food dollars. The consumer is paying you directly, and you're able to capture the greatest portion of their food dollars. Not only are you able to take the largest portion of the dollar value, but significantly, you have the final say over when you want to change that. So flexibility and adapting and changing your pricing at a moment's notice is a significant advantage, particularly as you're starting out with a food processing endeavor. And so you can be sitting at a market or setting up a website, and your price for a particular product can change from one day to the next. You might have a customer who wandered around the market and came back half an hour later, a little bit surprised to see that you pulled out your Sharpie marker and doubled your price. But that's your call. You can choose what you want to sell and how you sell it and the price for it. Not only the pricing, but the pack size, the volume that you're going to be selling in. If you're selling in 50-pound bags at one day, and a lot of people come up and they're asking you for 20 or 30-pound bags, the next week you can be packing your product into 20 or 30-pound bags or half-pound packages or by the spoonful. You can be changing these things very, very quickly, and that type of adaptations will serve you in the long run. Making those types of changes once you're selling it to a retailer or to a food service or to export is virtually impossible. Selling directly to consumers also opens up a wider variety of communication methods that you can use. When you're selling to retail, you're relying primarily on the print on your packaging and the graphic design to appeal to people and to grab their attention. When you're standing at a market, it's your skills in juggling that will attract people to your table. Your conversation skills, talking to people person to person and communicating with them in a number of different ways. Selling direct to consumer, we do primarily think of farmers markets, and that probably represents kind of the largest portion of direct to consumer sales. But we also need to consider selling from your own website. So setting up a shop, a WooCommerce or a different type of website shop can also be a great way to to directly communicate with your customers and sell to them individually without being there in person. And so that is a growing and significant way to sell directly to your own customers. And so whether that would be selling, at a drop-down location or home deliveries, there's also collaborative marketing methods like community-supported agriculture or food boxes, or working together with other producers to pool your products together. These can also be ways of selling direct to consumer without some of the constraints of a farmer's market. It gives you a lot of variety, a lot of different ways that you're able to connect with people. And that's the last point on my positive side here, as creating that community, being able to connect with people as individuals, creating connections between urban and rural, between farmers and consumers. And in an era of kind of growing polarization and political divide, selling direct to consumers, we can be acting as bridges, ways to hold society together and to foster greater understanding between individuals. But of course, there is a downside. Selling direct to consumers certainly represents smaller volumes and a limited reach. With the potential exception of website sales, you generally have to be within sight, within arm's reach of the people that you're selling to. So if your farm is 3 or 4 hours away from the nearest urban center, going to a farmer's market might be a full day or even a 2-day endeavor to be able to prepare and get ready for that market. And with all of the different demands being placed on your time, that sometimes just isn't possible to be able to be there in person to speak with each and every customer. Proximity is very, very important when you're selling direct to consumer, and it's extremely time consuming. If I drop off a pallet load of boxes at a distributor, those boxes then get brought to retail stores, and the retail store then sells it individually to customers. If I have to sell an entire pallet of product to individuals, person by person, there's no question which one is going to be more time efficient. The seasonality of selling in farmers markets is also a consideration. Some markets will be starting up just as you're jumping onto the tractor to start seeding your crops, and the busiest, most bustling markets of the year are likely going to be when you're harvesting. And so sometimes the seasonality of farmers markets can be unfortunately colliding quite poorly with the farming season. And of course, markets themselves are unpredictable with how many people are going to be there one week to the next. And that can be really difficult to manage and to bring product and to transport and to have the right variety for the people who are there at each moment. So not to be overlooked, I would say small but mighty is the direct-to-consumer sales. So next up, we have the mighty retail market. So this is packaging your product into a retail format that would be sitting in a grocery store on the shelves of one of the grocery retailers in your area. So this can certainly extend the geographic reach and the number of people who are going to be able to have access to purchasing your product. It extends your arm much, much further than the possibility of sitting at a farmer's market. And if you've ever sat at a farmer's market watching your valuable product getting rained on while the sports game is going on and there's just no one walking around the market, you know that this can be valuable. Having food products consistently available underneath one roof where consumers can go to aisle 6 when they need the products in aisle 6. It's a farmer's market every hour of every day, and you don't have to be there. So there's certainly value there. There is certainly a trend or a feel among retailers right now that promoting and encouraging local products within their stores is certainly desirable. And so it can be difficult to get onto the shelves of a retail store, but I do have the impression that that's getting easier. It looks like even some of the larger chain stores are going out of their way to encourage and to promote the local products that are close to them. So sometimes this means it might be easier to make it onto the shelf. And when you do, some of the stocking fees or the listing fees that would generally be associated with selling to retails might be foregone. So you might be able to avoid some of those costs that would usually be associated with selling to retail. When you're selling across the country, though, generally there is listing fees associated with having your product sitting on the retail shelf. I would suggest that that retail is probably the best for shelf-stable products, for smaller items and common items that don't rely on a sales pitch. If you need to drag people to your table by juggling and then convince them why they need to try something that they've never used before, this is probably a better fit for a direct-to-consumer sales, where retail is a better fit for a food product that people already know that they're going to be using. And now that your brand is situated right next to the national brand that consumers are used to buying, they have the opportunity to pause for a moment and give your product a bit of a second glance and determine whether they want to give you a try. So being positioned next to similar products can be intimidating, certainly when you're trying to match their pricing or kind of their professional packaging, but it can also be a huge boost when people are already looking in the right spot when they need that product. Retail stores certainly represent the potential for balanced year-round sales rather than the kind of fluctuations of some of the direct-to-consumer sales. This can be potentially even highest sales in the wintertime, or ideally, fairly consistent orders every few weeks or every month right throughout the year. And then when you are selling to retail, you do still have the opportunity to connect directly with your consumers through in-store demos and sampling. And this is something that store managers will certainly be requesting and asking you to be able to provide that service of providing samples. And it can certainly be time consuming, but it does represent an opportunity to have some of those direct-to-consumer connections while still having the convenience of having your product consistently on the shelves. But it's not without its difficulties. Selling to retail stores means that you're juggling two different customers. The retailer, who is also trying to run a business through selling different products, and the end consumer. Sometimes those two different needs and desires of those two different groups of people might not always correlate. You certainly will have a consumer, the end consumer, who would like to see a sale on your product and would love it if you were to offer a discount or promotional pricing. But the store manager will likely ask for 3 or 4 months lead time anytime you change the pricing, even just for a 1 month long promotion or a sale. So the needs of the retailer are always going to have to come first, and that's the main customer that you're looking to satisfy. And then in addition, you need to satisfy the needs of the end consumer after it's filtered through the needs of the store manager and the retailer. When you're selling to retail, you're going to have to be charging a smaller price than what would you be selling direct to consumer. So you're going to have to be developing a retail price as a suggested amount that the retailers will ask, and selling it to them at a reduced wholesale price. And so this can be, it is certainly a balance with being able to have the potential of a larger volume of sales. And if in your particular business, if there's a lot of overhead costs in the purchase and the setup of equipment that you need to prepare your product, having higher volumes might be worth the trade-off of lower pricing. But if you have fairly low overhead and minimal investment in equipment, then you might be better off with lower volumes and being able to ask higher prices if you're selling directly to your customer. There's certainly a lot of upfront costs as well when you're selling to retail. Your packaging and your labeling has to be compliant with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency regulations for designing compliant packaging. And so we'll talk about this later on in the future module, but there's a lot of different packaging elements, the allergen statements and the nutritional guidelines and bilingual display package that needs to meet those regulations before it will be accepted onto the store shelf. In addition to those regulations, there's also the need for shelf appeal, for having potentially a graphic designer on your team to be able to design a packaging that's going to grab people's attention. The photo here on the slide shows my own product or one of them, and I can't tell you how many times I've looked on a store shelf and I can't find my own product because I have these dull brown packages that I can't even find them when I'm looking for them. So there's certainly room for improvement with my own graphic design, and trying to design something that communicates the right type of feel and yet stands out among the competition is not an easy thing to balance. As I mentioned before, making changes to a product is difficult, costly, and slow compared to pulling out your Sharpie marker and changing the size of your product halfway through a farmer's market. Once you have a retail product, the retail UPC code is associated with a specific weight or volume, and changing that means reprinting packages, which can sometimes be 4 to 6 month long process of reprinting packages with a new weight and a new UPC code. And then once you've changed the packaging, applying to the retailer to change that package size, again, is a few month process to be able to get that approval. So you're looking at 6 months to a year to be able to make changes to a product and the cost associated with changing your packaging. In addition, retailers will have requirements for when you're delivering product, how often, how frequent, how many at a time. They might want to be ordering your product just 1 or 2 cases at a time, which might be smaller volumes than you had hoped for. They might have requirements for meeting certain sales targets or fitting into their promotional schedules. So once again, you do have to juggle 2 different consumers, the consumer who buys your product and the customer who you're selling directly to, which is the retailer themselves. So certainly a balancing act with selling to retail. So the next topic or category here would be selling to food service. So this would be bringing your product to restaurants or institutions that would be able to then prepare and serve meals or serve directly to consumers in something that's already been prepared for them. So this is not an easy market to grab, but it's certainly a really exciting one. It doesn't get much cooler feeling than working with a chef who's excited about your product, and then they're finding ways to combine that with other products or to bring out the best flavors and the seasonings to incorporate that product onto their menu. So it gives you an opportunity to really craft your product into something that's a touch more spectacular than oatmeal in your home kitchen. So selling to food service does also have the potential of some higher volumes. You'll certainly be getting sales inquiries for 50, 100, 500, and 1,000 pounds of product at a time, which can be certainly nice to work with. And so that's a little bit of a carrot for sure at the food service market. There is less emphasis on shelf appeal and graphic design. And so a chef doesn't really care too much what your product looks like in the package, but the requirements for what the product looks like, the product itself, the product consistency and the quality is going to be unmatched by the demands in any other industry. So the chefs are going to be a really, really tricky one to navigate. They will need your product to be consistent. Once they've added it to their menu, things can't change. If you have a slightly different parameter set on your milling equipment and the end product is just slightly different from one day to the next, this is going to make it very difficult for chefs to formulate it and to then pass on recipes and formulations to their line chefs to be able to keep a product consistent day in, week out. So certainly less important to have graphic designing on the packaging, but more important for the product itself to be high quality and consistent. The larger package size that you might be selling in maybe 20 or 40 or 50 pound bags, reduces the labor associated with packaging and certainly the cost of packaging as well. Kind of a rule of thumb would be that packaging a product is going to cost 50 cents to $1, irregardless of whether that's a half-pound package or a 50-pound package. Mostly the cost is not in the amount of material involved, it's the item itself. And so packing 50 pounds of product into one package is going to be much more cost efficient and less labor than packaging smaller retail products. However, there are the same certification labeling requirements as retail, so you do still need to have a professionally configured package with the same label elements. There are a few exceptions, a few things that don't need to be included, such as the bilingual labeling, but the allergen statements and the nutrition facts still need to be there, just like they are on the retail packaging. Also, I would say working with restaurants, the proximity to who you're selling to is also quite important. If a store runs out of your product and they call you and you say, sorry, I'm on the tractor right now, or I'm on vacation, it's going to be 2 weeks before I can deliver a product to you, the store manager might not be impressed, but they'll spread out the competitor's product next to you and they'll fill that gap in the shelf. If a restaurant owner calls up and says, we need more of your product, and you say, oh, sorry, I'm on the seat of the tractor right now, we're planting, or I'm on vacation, and it'll be 2 weeks before I can get product to you, the last thing that they want to do is remove a product from their menu. And so for them to have done the work of formulating a menu item around your product and then to not have that consistently available is something that's going to lose you a customer very, very quickly. So it does take quite a while to make inroads with a restaurant. They will only usually change their menu every, sometimes 6 months, every time, sometimes a year, sometimes only every few years they'll be making changes to their menu. And then once they've incorporated your product into their menu, there's no exceptions. It needs to be there. And kitchens are very busy places. It's not impossible for someone to get to the very bottom of a bag before they realize that they're right out of product. So you won't necessarily get quite as much flexibility and lead time for the orders as you would get with retail, where there's a little bit more leniency with deliveries. And so one more topic ahead. Last but not least, we're going to look really briefly at selling into the ingredient or the export market. So this would be looking at the pallet load or truckload quantities that you might be able to sell to someone who is going to do further processing. So whether this is selling grains to another brand product, potentially to a larger chain of restaurants or cafes, or selling directly to export for brokers to be reselling again to other brands and chains after that. And so I'm not going to focus on this a huge amount. It's not my area of expertise. It's something that I've only really dabbled in a very small amount. And it's something that is a little bit more similar to farming in that you're looking for a very few number of high impact buyers. You're usually looking to negotiate 2 or 3 different contracts throughout the year. And so it does act a little bit more like farming in that you're looking to negotiate contracts with a few brokers or buyers throughout the year, rather than kind of the smaller orders of retail food service or direct to consumer. Of course, the advantage with selling to the export or ingredient market is that you're looking at higher volumes. And so if you have really high infrastructure costs, you've had to pour a lot of money into setting up your processing facility, you might need high volumes just to be able to make the payments on the infrastructure that you've invested in. And so that is certainly a possibility. Any type of business is a little bit of a numbers game, and trying to balance off your capital investment with the return can be tricky. And sometimes that necessitates just higher and higher volumes. It's selling into the ingredient or export market also gives you the ability to focus in on a very, very specialized or niche crop or product. And so if you're looking at a crop that is a unique variety and then unique specs within that variety, or maybe taking a product and then processing it down to extract one particular element of it, let's say a bran from the wheat or something like this, it gives you that ability to focus really, really narrowly on something. And even though it's not something that the average consumer would go through very commonly, when the world is your market, then there's certainly potential for higher volumes when you're selling into that market. And again, this matches fairly well with grain farming because we have fairly large volume, large capacity farms. And so selling to that export market can help to actually use the product produced on a full, several thousand acre farm, whereas direct farm sales at farmers markets would be very, very difficult to get up to some of those volumes. The negative side, though, of selling to that export market, similar to kind of some of the farming game, pricing is usually set on that global race to the bottom economics game, where one year they might be able to accept a higher price, but as soon as there's someone offering the same product at a lower price, that's what's going to be offered, or that's what's going to be accepted. So it can be really difficult to manage the inconsistencies of demand as well. One year, if there's poor crops in one part of the world, you might get calls looking for a product, and then the next year there might be no calls at all, even though it was a really high demand in a product one certain year. And so some of those inconsistencies can be really difficult, especially when you're looking at the higher risk of producing really high volumes of a product. Again, with your exporting, you'd certainly needing to be following the federal regulations. So that's the Safe Food for Canadians license, and often the HACCP certification as well, which covers that whole food safety program, the full scope of the written programs and the audits that go along with that. So certainly a little bit more intense from the food safety certification side. And then exporting to each country may have individual criteria for each individual product. And that's something that can be quite a bit to navigate when you're looking at selling a product to multiple different places around the world. But a bit of a trade-off there with the potential of higher volumes that can match your production. So moving on from looking for a market that you might be selling to, we're going to jump over and take a look at some of the skill sets or labor requirements of running a food processing endeavor. So one of the primary considerations with adding on-farm processing should be in making a really thorough assessment of your own labor capacity. Again, on-farm processing isn't just making more money from the same crop that you've already grown. It's adding an additional business and another job to your already lengthy to-do list. This can be a really great match if your farm has underutilized labor capacity. Maybe there's a family member or a partner who wants to join in farm operations and is currently working off farm. But food processing requires you to wear quite a few different hats. So it is important to assess your own skills and abilities and then evaluate where you might need to be hiring or outsourcing to complete the remaining tasks. With starting a food processing business and a mill, I thought I was going to be spending my time testing out recipes and taking glamorous photos. Turns out that vacuuming grain dust is my most usual Friday afternoon entertainment. So when you look at farming, there's certainly a lot of skills that you already have in operating and maintaining farm machinery and equipment. And this is certainly a really great place to get started. There's going to be a lot of equipment repairs along the way, and calibrating and maintaining the equipment that you use for your processing business is going to be a huge asset. Farming has pretty intense requirements for understanding of science, agronomy, soil health, plant breeding, nutrient management. There's technological adaptations that you might be adding onto your farm, adding some new technologies onto your tractors or to your crop use. And of course, farming requires a fair degree of physical strength and stamina. With on-farm processing, there's the calibration and operation of all of the different equipment that you'll have to be acquiring. And this can be a little bit of a steep learning curve, trying to figure out how each machine is going to operate optimally to make sure that your product is top quality. And so there is some shared skills there with the mechanical and engineering skills that you may already have as a farmer. In addition, though, your facility and your food safety system will need to be designed and implemented and then tracked as well. And so developing a food safety system that's designed and tailored to your own product is an ongoing job that will require a lot of paperwork, documentation, to be able to keep everything, keep the records and the traceability that you need to have to make sure that your food product is safe. Communications and consumer relations is another aspect that on-farm processing will require. So having some type of skills in maybe graphic design or media, marketing through a website, photography, social media, videography, these are all elements that would be highly valued in an on-farm processing operation. My last point on the right-hand side, of course, cleaning. We've been there. We know it's with both farming and processing. I guess it comes into both. So some of the shared skills, again, mechanics and repairs, engineering and inventing. I would say this is perhaps a bit more intense on the on-farm processing side. With crops, we've got a pretty good tool set with us, and it's pretty uncommon that you'll need to be rejigging something inside your combine to get it to harvest your crop just right. With grain processing, that will likely come up fairly regularly, that the piece of equipment that you have doesn't quite fit the needs for your crop, and so there'll be a little bit of tweaking and inventing along the way. Certainly both farming and processing require market analysis, but they're a different type of market analysis. Again, farming, we're looking at international import and export requirements and some of those global factors. With on-farm processing, you're more likely looking at what does your local community need? What would meet the needs of your local stores or farmers market? Bookkeeping and accounting is essential, certainly with any business that you're going to be running. And so that's certainly a shared need. Creative problem solving and independence. These things will all serve you quite well in both farming and on-farm processing. So as you can see, there are some similar and some divergent skills with farming and food processing, but I think that the best match might come not with the skills themselves, but with the soft skills, the character traits that might make someone a good fit for both farming and food processing. So I would be summarizing this skill set and these character traits as the craziness to try something that no one else would think is a good idea, resilience and optimism when the results are not exactly the best, and the determination to try again and again and again and see if the outcome can be improved. Farming is not easy. There's a lot of times where you're going to fall on your face and things won't work out the way that you hope they would. And this is a shared concern with food processing. Resilience to keep trying and determination when things aren't going right is going to be essential in both areas. So another topic to give a bit of consideration as you dive into this world of food processing is a little bit of thought to your business structure. Of course, with any business that you might start, you have a few different options for either running as a sole proprietorship, as a partnership, if you have someone else who will be starting up the endeavor with you, or someone who's going to be investing in the project. And of course, you do have the option of running as a corporation as well, which gives the potential of a bit of arm's length distance between you and the entity itself. And some of these structural questions are very similar to the questions you would be facing with your own farm entity as well. So, but another question that you might want to spend a bit more time considering as well would be whether or not you want to be separating your processing business from your farm or whether you want to be combining them. There are some maybe minute but more tangible differences. When you go to file your taxes at the end of the year, if you're a farmer, CRA will have an expense line under farming for your twine and silage wrap, but they're not going to have a line for packaging your retail products for the packaging material in that inventory. So you might end up fitting those expense categories in, lumping it in with your twine and silage, which might be fine for the tax purposes. It's an expense, but it might be a little bit messy for yourself to be untangling. So you would want to likely keep separate records for your own entities, whether your farm and your processing business separate. And then as those get combined into the tax year, there might be some categories that get combined. Also consider that there may be tax implications with if there's a loss or profitability in one aspect and not in the other. So a loss on your farm entity could offset profit from the other, or vice versa. But sometimes having those two different entities entangled might mean that you're not actually able to thoroughly assess where you're losing money in one aspect or the other. And it might lead to neither of them being profitable if you're not fully understanding the financial situation of your farm and of your processing endeavor. So probably the most important advice would be to don't take advice from a farmer, talk to an accountant or a tax advisor who can look at your own particular situation, also looking at kind of long-term planning and what that might look like with a farm or entity succession and kind of future planning. So certainly that's worth reaching out and getting some specialized advice as you consider the structure of that business. So I think that brings us just about to the end of the topics that we're going to be addressing in this first module. There'll be 2 modules coming up with further details into some of the more detailed aspects of farm processing. But to wrap it up, I do have a survey that you can be accessing. And so if you're watching this module as a component of an in-person or a concurrent webinar, you might be given instructions for accessing a survey online that you'll be able to fill in your responses and then assess your farm suitability for adding on farm processing and then compare those results with the results of other participants, either at the same session or in previous sessions. So you may discover through that survey that your farm situation offers unique advantages or disadvantages compared to your fellow farmers. If you're watching this webinar, however, at 2 in the morning because you're losing sleep over potentially changing the direction of your farm and you've stumbled across this online, then there won't be other participants for you to compare the results with, but the questions may be helpful to guide your own reflection and decision-making process. Answering yes to these questions may mean that value-added processing could be a logical and easier fit for your farm. Answering no doesn't mean that it's a bad fit, but it does give you an indication of the areas that may pose more challenges for you, that might take extra work to overcome some of the hurdles that you'll face. So the first question to assess, is it important for your farm to maximize the income from a limited number of acres? Particularly when you're marketing to an end consumer, if you're selling direct to consumers or in retail as well, your sales will likely be measured in pounds, not in tons. So this can be a really great way to stretch out the income from a farm that has a smaller footprint, but for a larger farm, it may not be significant enough to be worth the extra burden. So the next question, does your farm have underutilized labor capacity? So this could be a partner looking to leave off-farm work, someone new looking to join the farm team, or yourself wanting to take on new responsibilities. On-farm processing isn't just making more money from your farm, it's adding a new component. So do you have that extra labor, or do you have access to hiring people who could meet those labor needs? Do you grow a unique product that's undervalued in the conventional markets? We'll look a little bit more in future webinars on pricing out your product and comparing it with some of the retail prices and seeing if those match up. But if you have a product that is not commonly grown otherwise, it might be a good niche for diving into on-farm processing. Question 4, would your farm budget benefit from consistency and from year-round cash flow? Smaller sales spread out evenly through the year rather than a few larger sales post-harvest. Sorry, I think I misread that. So there's two different aspects here. One is the sales being spread out throughout the year, so giving you more consistent cash flow, and the other is in workflow as well, where a lot of the milling and processing jobs can be either consistent throughout the year or even lumped into the off-season where you're not doing as many farm jobs. And then the last question on this slide, do you have strong organizational, communication, and financial management skills that will help you to keep on top of the different topics like inventory management, invoicing, financing, traceability, and bookkeeping? These will often represent a significant portion of the workload with on-farm processing. A rule of thumb with my own operation, and of course this will vary from farm to farm and processing facility, is that 1 hour on the seat of a tractor is likely going to be matched by at least 10 hours in the mill, and that 10 hours in the mill will be matched likely by an additional 10 hours of paperwork, just to give kind of a rough breakdown of what that looks like, again, in my own operation. So I'm going to switch over to the next slide and continue with the rest of the questions. So moving on to question 6, does your farm have buildings or infrastructure that could be used for grain cleaning, packaging, or storage? So whether this is some buildings that could be renovated and retrofitted to use for your processing facility, grain bins, and some of the equipment as well, like tractors or forklifts that you may have around, augers. These things can also be significant advantages as you start out. Does your farm have seed cleaning equipment or experience with operating, maintaining, or calibrating them? Graders, screen cleaners, indents, gravity tables. These are all really great places to start with adding seed cleaning and milling to your farm operations. And so if you already are used to operating some of these, this will certainly be a pretty big jump in your process. Does your farm have access to capital for purchasing processing equipment and the inventory that you'll need to get started? Certainly farming as well as food processing are both fairly capital intensive. And so is that going to be possible for you if you're expanding your operations with a new endeavor? Is that something that That's going to be, do you have access to the capital to be able to do that? Question 9, do you have a wide variety of communication skills? Marketing is communication, and marketing can take lots of different forms. It can be verbal and interpersonal, just talking to people and building relationships with store managers and chefs. It can be written as you're writing out text for some flyers or for a website. Graphic communication will certainly be an asset if you have skills with photography, social media, videography. But certainly some of each of these communication skills will be essential in building your on-farm food processing business. And finally, does your farm have close proximity to urban center and markets, considering the possibility of doing weekly or bi-weekly deliveries to markets, even if these are retail or to distributors, and then additional time to develop relationships with the consumers, retailers, and chefs, and being able to fulfill orders quickly and to keep your customers happy. I do want to emphasize as well that these questions may function to summarize some of the necessary elements of food processing, but as farmers, we know that we're out-of-the-box thinkers, and we can find our way around even the biggest hurdles if we put our minds to it. So even if you've got the no column filled with a few different check marks, don't let that get in your way. Simply know that it's something that you do need to be putting some focus and attention to be able to overcome those hurdles. So that brings us to the end of this module. And hopefully there are some questions that have been raised here and some information that will help you to make a decision as to whether or not value-added processing is going to be a good fit for your farm. So if you're able to take inventory of your farm, analyze your assets, what makes your own situation unique, and use some of the information from this module to help guide some of the decision-making processes along the way. Also, take the time that you need. Farm processing doesn't mean just one thing. There's lots of options and different ways of doing things, different approaches, different markets, different geographic reaches, different marketing techniques. Rushing into a decision likely means that things are going to be repeated and done over again as we plow past some of the mistakes. If you have the opportunity to talk to someone who's already doing a similar business, farmers, we tend to operate in little bubbles and world unto ourselves, but we're also generally quite willing to bring outsiders into our bubble and to show them around. So if you can reach out to people producing similar products in your region, or find someone who's producing an identical product in a different region, see what advice they can offer. When we started out our farm processing journey, we reached out to a few different farms that were doing similar products halfway across the country from us, and they were fantastically generous with their time, and it enabled us to tour around their facility for several days, learning from them, learning from their equipment, their setup, their design, some of their marketing techniques. And we've certainly encountered lots of really wonderful people along the way, and joining that community of food processors and farming can be one of the biggest assets of doing the farm processing journey. So if you find some people to collaborate and bounce ideas off of, ask if they think that your specific niche or product is a viable one. They may even have particular suggestions for what your sales targets might be, or if they've done something similar. Ask what they would have done differently in their own farm journey. Ask what advice they would give to someone following their path. Also, I hope it'll be helpful for you to access the next modules. So there will be the next presentation on operations, infrastructure, business flow, and human resources, diving into some of the details in a little bit more thorough way. And then the final module on marketing your grain products. So hopefully both of those will be helpful to you as well as you make a decision, and then give yourself time to reflect. What do you hope to gain from on-farm processing? Is this a realistic goal? And how can you step out with the best foot forward to create the farm processing endeavor that best matches your goals? I hope to see you over on the next modules.